Right now, you can walk into any store and buy pretty much whatever you want with a piece of plastic or some crumpled paper bills. But 700 years ago, money worked totally differently. And people were traded like objects at the local market. Today, I'm going to show you the most shocking things humans were sold for during the Middle Ages. We're talking about lives exchanged for farm animals, children traded for stale bread, and entire families sold for less than you'd pay for lunch today. But here's what's going to blow your mind. Some of these trades weren't even about money. They were about survival. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why a simple jug of wine could be worth more than a human life, and how a handful of salt could change someone's destiny forever. The stories I'm about to share with you come from actual historical records, court documents, and merchant ledgers from across medieval Europe. These aren't myths or legends, they're real transactions that happened to real people. This isn't just about slavery. This is about a world where human value was measured differently than anything we can imagine today. A world where your worth could be decided by whether the harvest was good that year, or if your lord needed a new hunting dog more than he needed another servant. And trust me, the 10th story on this list, about people sold for debts as small as a meal, is going to make you rethink everything you thought you knew about medieval life. Let me tell you something personal first. When I started researching medieval economics 3 years ago, I thought I understood how brutal life was back then. I'd read about wars, plagues, famines, but nothing prepared me for what I found in the merchant records from places like Venice, London, and Paris. The casual way human beings were listed alongside sacks of grain and barrels of wine in trade ledgers. The way children were literally priced like livestock in market stalls. It changed how I see history completely. The Middle Ages weren't just a time of knights and castles. They were a time when human desperation created an entire economy built on trading people. And what's most disturbing is how logical it all seemed to the people living through it. When your family was starving, when war had destroyed your crops, when disease had killed your livestock, selling a person might be the only way to keep everyone else alive. So let's dive into these 10 shocking examples of what people were actually sold for. But I want to warn you, some of these stories are going to be hard to hear. They reveal a side of human nature and medieval society that most history books gloss over. The raw desperation, the impossible choices, and the way people learned to put a price on everything, including each other. Number 1. Sold for a cow or a pig. Picture this, you're standing in a medieval marketplace in 1347, somewhere in what's now northern France. The smell of fresh bread mixes with the stench of animal waste. Merchants are shouting prices for everything from chickens to cloth. And then you hear something that makes you stop dead in your tracks. One healthy young woman, good for field work and childcare, will trade for 2 cows or 3 pigs. This actually happened. Not once, but thousands of times across medieval Europe. Human beings were regularly traded for farm animals, and the records prove it. In fact, in medieval Ireland, slaves could, like cattle, become a form of internal or trans-border currency. The comparison wasn't just metaphorical, it was literal economic policy. Let me tell you about Agnes of Winchester. That's not her real name. Her real name was lost to history, like so many others. But her story survived in a legal document from 1398. Agnes was sold by her debt-ridden father to a local merchant for the price of 1 milk cow and 2 piglets. The document, written in Latin on crumbling parchment, lists her right alongside the other items being traded that day. Item, 1 cow with calf, value 12 pence. Item, 1 serving girl, age approximately 15 years, value equal to 1 cow with calf. Think about that for a second. A 15-year-old girl's entire life was worth exactly the same as a cow and her baby. But here's what's really disturbing. This wasn't considered unusual or cruel by medieval standards. It was just business. The reason animals were often more valuable than people comes down to basic economics. A cow could provide milk, cheese, and eventually meat. It could reproduce and create more cows. In a world where most people barely survive from harvest to harvest, that guaranteed food source was worth more than another mouth to feed. Pigs were even more valuable because they could eat almost anything and reproduce quickly. 1 pig could become 20 pigs in just a few years. But humans had to be fed every day. They got sick. They got old. They had emotions and could rebel. From a purely economic standpoint, in a society hanging on by a thread, livestock was simply a better investment than people. I found a fascinating record from a monastery in northern England, dated 1356. The monks kept detailed accounts of every transaction, and they record trading one young man, strong of back but simple of mind, for 2 breeding sows and 1 barrel of salted pork. The monks justified this by saying the pigs would feed the monastery for years, while a man would only be able to work for a few decades before becoming too old to be useful. The most heartbreaking part of these records is how matter-of-fact they are. There's no emotion, no recognition that lives were being destroyed. Just cold calculations, human versus animal, cost versus benefit, survival versus morality. This system created a horrifying feedback loop. The more people were traded like animals, the more they were seen as animals. The more they were seen as animals, the easier it became to justify trading them. Families learned to think of their children not as beloved sons and daughters, but as potential assets that could be liquidated during hard times. In the coastal regions of medieval Britain, where fishing was the primary industry, the calculations were even more brutal. A good fishing boat needed a crew of 6 to 8 men. But replacing a man who died or got injured was much easier than replacing a boat that was destroyed in a storm. So boat owners would keep detailed lists of men they could buy or trade for, while treating their vessels like precious treasures. The records show that during particularly harsh winters, the price of humans actually dropped below the price of livestock. In 1348, during the worst part of the Black Death, one document from southern France shows a healthy adult man being traded for half a cow. The reasoning? So many people were dying from plague that there were more workers than jobs, but the livestock were dying just as fast while being much harder to replace. But here's what's going to surprise you even more. These weren't always desperate poor people making these trades. Sometimes wealthy merchants and even nobles would trade their servants and slaves for animals because they saw it as a smart business decision. A merchant named Thomas Brightwell, according to records from 1372, owned 17 servants and regularly traded them for livestock, treating his human property exactly like a farmer manages his herd. The psychological impact on the people being traded must have been devastating. Imagine being told by your own family that you were worth less than a pig. Imagine being handed over to a stranger and knowing that your new owner valued his cows more than your life. Some of the court records mention people who tried to run away after being traded, only to be hunted down like escaped livestock and returned to their owners. And this wasn't limited to just Europe. Trade records from the Byzantine Empire show similar exchanges happening across the Mediterranean. Human slaves were regularly traded for donkeys, goats, and even chickens in major trading cities like Constantinople and Alexandria. The most disturbing part? These trades were often seen as merciful. Parents who sold their children for livestock told themselves they were saving their families from starvation. Lords who traded their servants for pigs convinced themselves they were making practical decisions for the good of their estates. Everyone found a way to justify treating humans like commodities. But what's really going to shock you is that farm animals weren't even the most bizarre things people were sold for. Because sometimes a human life was worth less than a drink. Number 2. A jug of wine equals a human life. If you think trading people for farm animals was bad, wait until you hear about this next one. Because sometimes the valuable item being traded for a human being wasn't even something that would last more than a few hours. Sometimes it was just alcohol. In medieval Europe, wine wasn't just a drink. It was medicine, currency, and social status all rolled into one. Clean water was often hard to find, so people drank wine and ale with every meal, including children. But during times of shortage, wine became so precious that people would trade anything to get it. And I mean anything. Let me tell you about a case from 1389 in what's now Germany. A man named Klaus von Steinheim had racked up massive gambling debts. We're talking about the medieval equivalent of losing your house in Vegas. He owed money to everyone, other nobles, merchants, even the local church. But instead of selling his land or his possessions, Klaus made a different choice. According to the court records, Klaus traded his 12-year-old nephew to a wine merchant for just 3 jugs of fine wine from the Rhine Valley. 3 jugs. That's probably less wine than you drink at a wedding today. But Klaus was so desperate for alcohol and so deep in debt that he convinced himself this was reasonable. The document, written in medieval German, is almost impossible to read today, but historians have translated the key passage. Klaus von Steinheim, being of sound mind but heavy burden, does hereby grant unto Heinrich the wine merchant one boy child of his blood, in exchange for 3 measures of wine, to be delivered forthwith. But Klaus wasn't unique. The legal archives from medieval cities are full of similar cases. People trading family members for alcohol was so common that many cities had specific laws about it. Some places required a waiting period before the trade could be finalized. Others required witnesses to testify that the person making the trade wasn't currently drunk. Think about that for a second. They had to make laws to prevent people from trading their families while they were drunk because it was happening so often. The reason wine was so valuable comes down to medieval life being absolutely brutal. People worked from dawn to dusk doing backbreaking labor. They lived in constant fear of disease, war, and starvation. For many people, getting drunk was the only escape from a life of misery. And when you're living in that kind of desperation, the immediate relief of alcohol can seem worth any price. I found records from a monastery in medieval France that document dozens of these alcohol for human trades. The monks weren't even bothered by it. They treated it as a normal part of their business. One entry from 1367 records. Today received from Jean the baker one young woman, approximately 20 years of age, in exchange for 4 bottles of our best wine and 1 bottle of ale. The woman shall work in the kitchens until her debt is paid. What debt? The debt her husband Jean had created by trading her for alcohol. The monks saw nothing wrong with accepting a human being as payment for drinks. But here's where it gets really dark. Sometimes these trades weren't even about desperation, they were about addiction. Medieval people could develop serious drinking problems just like people today, but they had no understanding of addiction as a disease. They just knew they needed alcohol, and they would trade anything to get it. A court case from 1423 in northern Italy describes a merchant who traded his entire family, wife and 3 children, to different tavern owners for wine and ale. Not all at once, but over the course of several months. Each time he ran out of money for drinks, he would trade another family member. By the end, he was drinking alone while his family was scattered across the city, working as servants to pay for his addiction. The most heartbreaking part of these records is reading the testimony from family members who were traded. In one case from 1392, a woman named Marguerite testified before a court that her husband had traded her to a tavern keeper for 6 jugs of wine and a promise of more to come. She begged the court to void the trade, saying she had small children who needed her. The court's response? They ruled that since her husband was legally her owner, he had the right to trade her for whatever he wanted. The trade stood. Marguerite was forced to work in the tavern for years to pay off her husband's drinking debt. But alcohol wasn't always about addiction or desperation. Sometimes it was about status. In medieval society, being able to offer wine to guests was a sign of wealth and importance. Some people would trade servants or family members just so they could throw impressive parties and look successful. A record from 1341 describes a minor nobleman who traded 2 of his servants to a wine merchant so he could host an elaborate feast for a visiting lord. The servants were worth about 6 months of wages each, but the wine he received was consumed in a single evening. The nobleman thought this was a good trade because impressing the visiting lord might lead to better opportunities later. The geographical spread of these wine for human trades tells us something interesting about medieval society. These cases are most common in wine-producing regions like France, Germany, and northern Italy. In areas where wine was rare and expensive, people were more likely to trade humans for it. But in regions where wine was common, people traded humans for other luxuries. And it wasn't just wine. Records show similar trades for ale, mead, and even distilled spirits in areas where those were available. The common thread was always the same: alcohol was seen as immediately valuable, while humans were seen as long-term problems. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the personal diary of a medieval merchant named Giovanni Bertolini. He kept meticulous records of all his trades, and over a 20-year period, he recorded accepting at least 40 humans in exchange for various alcoholic beverages. He writes about it like he's discussing trading sheep or grain, no emotion, just business calculations. Giovanni's diary reveals something crucial about medieval economics. He notes that humans traded for alcohol were usually desperate and therefore worked harder and complained less than servants acquired through other means. The shame and desperation that led them to make the trade also made them more compliant workers. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these alcohol for human trades is how they were often celebrated. When Klaus von Steinheim, the German nobleman I mentioned earlier, received his 3 jugs of wine, he threw a party to celebrate the trade. His friends congratulated him on making such a clever deal. Nobody questioned the morality of trading a child for alcohol. And this brings us to an important point about medieval morality. What seems absolutely horrifying to us today was often seen as normal, even smart by medieval standards. The concept of inherent human dignity that we take for granted today simply didn't exist in the same way back then. But if you think trading people for alcohol is shocking, wait until you hear what parents would do when their children were starving. Number 3. Children for bread. This next story is going to be the hardest one for me to tell, and probably the hardest one for you to hear. Because we're talking about something that goes against every natural instinct, parents selling their own children just to get food for the family. It's 1315, and Europe is in the grip of the Great Famine. It's been raining for 3 straight years. Crops have rotted in the fields. Animals are dying of disease. People are starving in numbers that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. And in this desperate world, parents are facing an impossible choice. Watch all their children die slowly, or sell some of them to save the others. Let me tell you about Marie of Rouen. That's the name historians have given her. Her real name is lost, like so many others from this period. Marie had 4 children under the age of 10. Her husband had died the previous winter from hunger and cold. She had no land, no skills that anyone would pay for, and no food. The historical record of her story comes from the account books of a local monastery. On March 15, 1316, Marie arrived at the monastery gates carrying her youngest child, a boy about 3 years old. She spoke with the abbot and made a deal. In exchange for 6 loaves of bread, not fresh bread, but week-old loaves that were getting moldy, she would give them her son. 6 loaves of bread. That's what a mother decided her child was worth when the alternative was watching him starve to death along with her other children. The monastery records show this wasn't unusual. During the Great Famine, they acquired dozens of children this way. The monks saw it as charity. They were saving children from starvation and giving parents a chance to keep their other children alive. But the economics are brutal. The bread Marie received probably lasted her family less than a week. Her 3-year-old son would work for the monastery for the rest of his life. But here's what makes these stories even more heartbreaking. Often, it wasn't even good bread. Records from various monasteries and wealthy households show children being traded for stale bread, moldy bread, even bread that was mostly sawdust mixed with a little bit of grain. People were so desperate that they would accept any food, no matter how poor the quality. A document from 1317, found in the archives of a monastery in what's now Belgium, records the trade. 1 female child, age approximately 7 years, received from her mother in exchange for 4 loaves of barley bread, 2 days past fresh, and 1 small portion of cheese rind. Cheese rind. Not even actual cheese, just the leftover rind that would normally be thrown away. The psychology behind these trades is almost impossible for us to understand today. Imagine being a parent and doing the math. If I keep all 4 children, we all die. If I trade 2 children for food, maybe the other 2 will live long enough for things to get better. It's a calculation no parent should ever have to make, but medieval parents made it thousands of times during famines. And the children understood what was happening. Court records from several cases mention children begging their parents not to trade them, promising they would eat less, promising they would work harder. But when the choice is between certain death for everyone or possible survival for some, parents made the brutal choice. The bread for children trades weren't limited to famines, though. Even during normal years, very poor families would sometimes trade children for food when winter supplies ran low. A record from 1402 in northern England describes a family who traded their 8-year-old daughter for 1 sack of grain, sufficient for making bread for 1 month. The calculation was simple: 1 less mouth to feed, plus food to keep the rest of the family alive. What's particularly disturbing is how organized these trades became. During the Great Famine, some monasteries and wealthy households started sending representatives to the poorest villages specifically to trade food for children. They knew desperate parents would make these deals, and they saw it as a way to acquire workers cheaply while appearing charitable. One such representative was a man named Brother Thomas, who worked for a monastery in southern France. His personal journal, discovered in the 1890s, documents his trips to starving villages. He writes, "Today acquired 6 children in exchange for 2 bushels of barley and some old bread. The parents wept, but agreed it was God's will. The children will serve the monastery well." Brother Thomas saw himself as doing God's work, saving children from starvation. But he was also acquiring a workforce that would serve the monastery for decades, all for the price of some cheap grain. The regional variations in these trades tell us about the different ways medieval economies worked. In grain-producing areas, children were more often traded for bread and flour. In coastal areas, they were traded for dried fish. In forested regions, they were traded for preserved meat and nuts. But everywhere, the calculation was the same: a child in exchange for temporary relief from hunger. Some of the most detailed records come from the city of Paris during the famine years. The city government kept careful track of these transactions because they were worried about public order. Their records show that during the worst months of 1316, an average of 12 children per day were being traded for food within the city walls. The types of bread involved in these trades also reveal the desperation involved. Good white bread made from wheat flour was reserved for the wealthy. The bread being traded for children was usually dark, coarse bread made from barley, oats, or even ground acorns. Sometimes it wasn't really bread at all, but a kind of porridge made from whatever grain scraps could be found. A particularly heartbreaking record from 1318 describes a mother who traded her twin babies, just 6 months old, for one loaf of bread mixed with sawdust and ground bark. The babies were too young to even eat solid food, but she traded them anyway because she needed something to feed her older children. The emotional trauma of these trades affected entire communities. Village records from the famine period show increased rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide among parents who had traded their children. The guilt and shame of these decisions haunted families for generations. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how these trades were often seen as acts of love rather than cruelty. Parents convinced themselves, and society supported them in believing, that giving up a child to ensure that child's survival was the ultimate sacrifice a parent could make. The alternative, watching all their children die, seemed worse than the pain of separation. A letter from 1319, written by a mother to the monastery where she had traded her daughter, shows this painful love. I pray daily that God will forgive me for giving away my sweet child. But I see her when I visit, and she is fed and warm. Her brothers and sisters are alive because of her sacrifice. I tell myself this was the right choice, but my heart breaks every day. The monastery kept the letter, probably as proof that they were providing a good home for the children they had acquired. But reading it today, all we can see is the impossible choice a mother was forced to make. And if you think trading children for bread represents the bottom of human desperation, you haven't heard anything yet. Because sometimes, people weren't even traded for basic survival needs. Sometimes, they were traded for luxury items that served no purpose other than showing off. Number 4. Exchanged for hunting dogs. Now we're moving from desperate survival trades to something that reveals a completely different side of medieval values. Because while poor families were trading their children for bread, wealthy nobles were trading their servants and slaves for hunting dogs. Not because they needed the dogs to survive, but because having expensive hunting dogs was a status symbol. Let me paint you a picture of medieval noble priorities. Imagine you're a wealthy lord in 1378, living in a castle in what's now northern France. You own thousands of acres of land, dozens of villages, and hundreds of people who work for you. You have more food than you could eat in 10 lifetimes. But your neighbor just got a new breed of hunting dog from Spain, and now everyone's talking about how impressive his hunts are. What do? You trade some of your human property for dogs, of course. This actually happened, and we have the records to prove it. A nobleman named Geoffrey de Montfort made exactly this kind of trade in 1379. According to the contract, which still exists in the French National Archives, Geoffrey traded 2 strong men, skilled in field work and construction, for 3 Spanish hunting hounds, trained in the pursuit of deer and wild boar. But here's what makes this even more absurd. Geoffrey already owned hunting dogs. He just wanted better ones. The contract notes that his existing dogs were sufficient for the hunt but lacking in the refinement expected of a lord of his standing. So he traded 2 human beings for slightly fancier dogs. The economics of this trade reveals something crucial about medieval society. Those 2 men Geoffrey traded were probably worth about 2 years' wages, each if he had hired them as workers. The dogs he received would live maybe 8 to 10 years at most. From a purely practical standpoint, this was a terrible deal. But it wasn't about practicality, it was about status. Hunting wasn't just a hobby for medieval nobles, it was a way to demonstrate wealth, power, and sophistication. The quality of your hunting dog said something about your place in society. A lord with excellent dogs was seen as more successful, more connected, and more worthy of respect than a lord with ordinary dogs. The most detailed account of these dog-for-human trades comes from the personal records of an English lord named Sir William Ashby. Between 1385 and 1402, Sir William made at least 7 separate trades where he exchanged servants, slaves, or villains for hunting dogs. His estate records show that he saw these trades as investments in his social standing. In one particularly revealing entry, Sir William writes, "Today completed trade with Lord Edmund of Chester. Gave him 2 kitchen maids and 1 stable boy in exchange for his prize bloodhound and 2 of her pups. The dog's bloodline is excellent, descended from the hounds of the Duke of Normandy. This acquisition shall greatly enhance my standing when we hunt with the king's party this autumn." Sir William was literally trading human beings to impress the king. And the crazy part, it probably worked. Medieval chronicles mention Sir William's exceptional hunting parties and his magnificent hounds. The people he traded were forgotten, but his dogs made him famous. But it wasn't just about the dogs themselves, it was about the entire culture around hunting. Medieval nobles would spend enormous amounts of money on hunting equipment, hunting clothes, hunting parties, and anything else related to the sport. Having the right dogs was just one part of an elaborate system of social competition. A fascinating document from 1392 shows how complex these status calculations could get. A lord named Robert de Vere was offered a trade, the best hunting dog for 3 skilled craftsmen. He spent weeks consulting with other nobles, trying to decide if the trade would raise or lower his social status. In the end, he declined the trade because his advisors convinced him that being seen to give up his famous dog would make him look desperate, even though the 3 craftsmen were objectively more valuable. The regional variations in these trades are interesting too. In England, where deer hunting was particularly popular among the nobility, people were most often traded for deerhounds and bloodhounds. In France, where wild boar hunting was more common, the trades usually involved boarhounds and mastiffs. In Germany, where wolf hunting was still necessary for protecting villages, people were traded for wolf hunting breeds. The church's attitude toward these trades reveals the moral contradictions of medieval society. While the church officially condemned trading humans like property, many church officials were themselves nobles who participated in hunting culture. Some bishops and abbots are recorded making these same dog-for-human trades. A scandalous case from 1396 involved the Bishop of Winchester, who traded 2 young men from his household for a pack of Italian hunting dogs. When questioned about this by other church officials, the bishop defended himself by saying that the dogs would be used to hunt game for feeding the poor, making it an act of charity. Nobody believed him, but nobody was willing to challenge a bishop directly. The training involved in these hunting dogs was incredibly sophisticated, which helped justify their high value in the minds of medieval nobles. These dogs were bred for specific tasks, trained from puppyhood by expert handlers, and could perform complex hunting maneuvers that required years of practice. In some ways, they were more highly educated than many of the people being traded for them. But here's what's really disturbing about these trades: the dogs were often treated better than the humans they were traded for. Medieval nobles kept detailed records of their dogs' health, diet, and training. They employed professional dog handlers, built special kennels, and even had court musicians compose songs about their favorite hunting hounds. Meanwhile, the humans they traded away were usually just sent to work in fields or kitchens with no further thought. A dog might have its own painted portrait and a place of honor in the Great Hall, while the human beings traded for it would remain nameless and forgotten. One of the most extreme examples comes from the court records of the Duke of Berry, one of the wealthiest men in medieval Europe. In 1411, the Duke traded an entire family, husband, wife, and 3 children for a single hunting dog that had been specially trained to hunt wolves. The dog was so famous that other nobles would travel hundreds of miles just to see it perform. The family the Duke traded away? We don't even know their names. They disappear from history completely after that transaction. But the dog, a massive mastiff named Charlemagne, appears in numerous historical documents and even had its own tomb when it died. The psychological impact on the people being traded must have been devastating. Imagine being told that you were worth less than a dog, not just any dog, but a dog that existed purely for entertainment. The humiliation and dehumanization involved in these trades went far beyond the practical hardships. Some of the court records mention people who tried to refuse these trades, arguing that they were skilled craftsmen or loyal servants who deserved better treatment. But their protests were usually ignored. A dog's pedigree was considered more important than a human's feelings. And the irony is that many of these prized hunting dogs weren't even particularly useful for anything other than showing off. They were bred more for appearance and prestige than for practical hunting ability. So people were being traded for dogs that were essentially living status symbols. But even luxury hunting dogs weren't the most ridiculous thing people were traded for. Because sometimes the valuable commodity was something even more basic than food or entertainment. Sometimes it was just seasoning. Number 5. A pile of salt. In the shadowed corridors of medieval commerce, few substances commanded more respect or desperation than the humble grain of salt. What we today casually sprinkle on our meals was once so precious that human lives were weighed against mere handfuls of these crystalline treasures. Salt was not merely a seasoning in the medieval world. It was survival itself. Without refrigeration, salt provided the only reliable method of preserving meat and fish through harsh winters. It prevented the putrefaction that could mean the difference between life and starvation when crops failed and hunting grew scarce. The economics of salt created a brutal calculus of human worth. In regions far from coastal areas or natural salt deposits, this white gold became so scarce that traders would literally weigh human beings against bags of salt. Historical records from 12th century Bavaria reveal cases where serfs were exchanged for quantities of salt weighing no more than 20 pounds, less than what a modern family might use in a year. Consider the plight of Heinrich, a peasant farmer recorded in the chronicles of the monastery of Fulda in 1186. When his lord's granary ran empty during a particularly harsh winter, Heinrich faced an impossible choice. His youngest son, barely 12 years old, was offered to a salt merchant from the Alpine regions in exchange for enough salt to preserve the remaining livestock through spring. The boy's life was valued at precisely 15 pounds of coarse rock salt, a transaction that would ensure the family's survival, but at the cost of their son's freedom. The salt trade routes became highways of human trafficking, where merchants calculated profit margins not just in goods, but in lives. Venetian trading records from the 13th century show detailed inventories listing salt, spices, silk, and slaves with equal commercial detachment. In these ledgers, we find entries where 3 pounds of fine Mediterranean sea salt could purchase a young woman from the Slavic regions, the very etymology of the word slave tracing back to these Slavic peoples who were so frequently traded. The psychological impact of salt for human exchanges reveals the brutal pragmatism of medieval survival. In the harsh mathematics of subsistence living, families were forced to commodify their own members. Village elders would sometimes draw lots to determine which children would be traded for salt when winter stores ran low. These weren't decisions made by monsters, but by desperate people trapped in a system where salt meant survival, and survival trumped sentiment. Archaeological evidence supports these grim historical accounts. Excavations at medieval trading posts along the salt roads have uncovered shackles alongside salt storage containers, suggesting these transactions were so common that merchants came prepared for both commodities. At the trading post of Hallion in Austria, whose very name derives from the Celtic word for salt, archaeologists discovered binding chains sized for children, a stark reminder of how young lives were bartered for mineral wealth. The social stratification created by salt wealth demonstrates how this mineral reshaped medieval society. Salt merchants became powerful figures, their wealth built not just on preserving food, but on the systematic dehumanization of the desperate. They established networks that stretched across continents, with human cargo flowing one direction and salt flowing the other. Religious authorities of the time struggled with the moral implications of salt-human exchanges. Church documents from the period reveal heated theological debates about whether trading humans for salt constituted a form of simony, the sin of buying and selling sacred things. Some bishops argued that since humans were made in God's image, exchanging them for any material good was blasphemous. Others pragmatically recognized that without such trades, entire communities might perish, creating a moral quandary that divided medieval Christianity. The linguistic legacy of salt's value persists in our modern language. The word salary derives from the Latin salarium, referring to the salt rations paid to Roman soldiers. But in the medieval context, this etymological connection took on a darker meaning. Humans were literally paid a salary, their lives converted into the mineral that preserved not just meat, but entire economies. Regional variations in salt availability created a patchwork of human value across medieval Europe. In coastal areas where salt was abundant, humans commanded higher prices, perhaps a cart of tools or livestock. But inland, particularly in mountainous regions where salt arrived only through dangerous trade routes, the equation shifted dramatically. A single bag of salt could purchase multiple people, their combined lifetimes valued less than what we would today consider a trivial amount of seasoning. As we examine these solved-for-human transactions, we must remember that behind each statistical entry lay a human story. Families torn apart, children separated from parents, individuals whose entire futures were determined by the weight of mineral crystals on a merchant scale. The white grains that preserved medieval food also preserved a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for reducing people to commodities when survival was at stake. Number 6. Soul for weapons. The clangor of hammer on anvil echoed through medieval smithies, but the true forge of human bondage was not the blacksmith's fire. It was the insatiable demand for weapons that transformed people into currency, their lives exchanged for the very instruments that would enforce their servitude. In an age where warfare was endemic and personal protection paramount, weapons represented more than mere tools. They were the difference between power and powerlessness, between lord and serf, between life and death. This desperate need for arms created a market where human beings became the standard currency for purchasing implements of war. The trading records of 12th century arms dealers reveal a chilling commercial calculus. In the workshops of Milan, renowned for their armor and blade work, craftsmen maintained ledgers that listed human beings alongside iron ingots and leather strips as acceptable payment. A quality longsword, taking weeks to forge and requiring the finest steel, could command the price of 3 healthy adults, while a crossbow with its complex mechanism might be bartered for an entire family. Consider the case of Godwin the weaponsmith, whose workshop in 1203 Canterbury became a hub for human trafficking disguised as arms dealing. Church records show that Godwin accepted people as payment for weapons with such regularity that he maintained holding pens adjacent to his forge. When Baron Aldrich of Wessex required equipment for his retinue, but lacked silver, he offered 17 serfs from his lands in exchange for swords, spears, and mail shirts. Each human life was appraised based on their physical condition and potential for labor, then converted into weapon values with businesslike efficiency. The psychological dynamics of weapon-for-human trades reveal the brutal pragmatism of medieval warfare economics. Knights and nobles who needed to arm themselves for campaigns or defend their holdings faced a stark reality. Silver was scarce, but people were abundant. The feudal system created a ready supply of bondsmen who could be converted into military assets through this grim form of barter. Archaeological evidence from castle armories across Europe supports these historical accounts. At Château de Vincennes, excavations revealed weapon storage areas adjacent to what researchers initially thought were serving quarters, but which closer examination showed were actually holding cells with reinforced doors and minimal amenities. The proximity suggests these spaces housed humans awaiting exchange for military equipment. The technological sophistication of medieval weapons directly influenced human valuations in these trades. A simple spear, requiring minimal skill and materials to produce, might purchase one person, but a Damascus steel blade, with its folded metal and razor edge, could command 10 or more lives. The crossbow, with its mechanical complexity and ability to penetrate plate armor, often required entire families as payment. These valuations created a hierarchy of human worth based entirely on the sophistication of the weapons they could purchase. Regional warfare patterns shaped these weapon-human exchanges in distinctive ways. In the contested borderlands between England and Scotland, where raids were frequent and arms essential, people were traded for weapons with particular urgency. The Chronicle of Melrose Abbey records instances where Scottish raiders would capture English peasants specifically to trade them to Irish weaponsmiths for spears and axes, creating a circular economy of violence where conflict generated both the need for weapons and the human currency to purchase them. The quality assessment of both weapons and humans in these transactions followed similar brutal logic. Arms dealers developed expertise in evaluating human merchandise, just as they assessed blade temper and armor thickness. Strength, age, health, and potential skills all factored into calculations. A young man capable of farm work might equal a well-balanced sword, while a woman skilled in weaving could command the price of a crossbow with its bolts. The moral complexity of these trades reveals itself in contemporary religious writings. Bishop Bartholomew of Exeter wrote in 1198 about the unholy trinity of war, weapons, and human bondage, noting how the pursuit of arms led Christian lords to treat fellow Christians as mere objects of exchange. Yet even he acknowledged the practical necessity, writing that a lord without weapons cannot protect his people, but obtaining weapons through such means may damn his soul. The logistics of weapon-human exchanges required sophisticated networks that spanned continents. Venetian merchants would ship weapons produced in Germanic lands to Byzantine markets, accepting payment in Slavic captives who would then be transported to Muslim territories where they commanded premium prices. These circular trade routes created a global economy where human suffering enabled military technology to flow across cultural and religious boundaries. Women's roles in weapon-human trades differed significantly from men's, reflecting both medieval gender dynamics and the specific demands of arms dealing. Skilled female weavers could produce the textile components for armor, gambesons, padding, and bindings, making them valuable commodities. However, they were often traded not for their craft skills but for their reproductive potential, with weapon dealers calculating future production of children who could themselves be converted into arms. The seasonal patterns of weapon-human trading followed the rhythms of medieval warfare. Spring campaigns required fresh equipment, creating peak demand for arms and corresponding spikes in human trafficking. Castle armories would empty during winter planning sessions as lords calculated what equipment they needed and which of their people they could spare to obtain it. These seasonal fluctuations created predictable patterns of human misery tied directly to the agricultural and military calendar. The technological arms race of the medieval period intensified these human trades. As armor improved, weapons had to become more sophisticated to penetrate it, driving up prices and requiring more human lives as payment. The development of the longbow in Wales, capable of piercing mail at long range, created such demand that entire Welsh communities were depopulated as people were traded for these revolutionary weapons. Guild regulations attempted to impose some structure on these trades, though primarily for economic rather than humanitarian reasons. The Armorers Guild of London established standard rates of exchange, human values calibrated against weapon specifications with mathematical precision. These regulations weren't intended to protect people, but to prevent price manipulation and ensure consistent profit margins for guild members. The psychological impact on communities subjected to weapon-human trading created lasting trauma that shaped medieval social structures. Villages learned to hide their young men during arms dealer visits, leading to the development of elaborate early warning systems. Some communities would preemptively trade their weakest members to protect their strongest, creating internal hierarchies of expendability that poisoned social relationships for generations. As we examine these weapon-human exchanges, we confront an uncomfortable truth about medieval society, that the instruments of protection and warfare were literally forged for human lives. The swords that defended castles, the spears that won battles, the crossbows that changed military tactics all carry the hidden cost of countless individuals whose freedom was sacrificed on the altar of military necessity. Each gleaming blade represented not just skillful metalwork, but the commodification of human existence in service of medieval warfare's endless appetite for better ways to kill and survive. Number 7. A new outfit. In the hierarchical spectacle of medieval society, where appearance determined social standing and clothing declared one's place in the world, the desire for fine apparel created a market so twisted that human beings were traded for mere garments, their entire lives deemed worth less than a bolt of silk or an embroidered gown. Clothing in medieval Europe functioned as more than mere covering. It was a complex language of power, wealth, and social position. Sumptuary laws strictly regulated who could wear what materials, colors, and styles, making forbidden fabrics symbols of ultimate status. This artificial scarcity transformed textiles into objects of obsessive desire, valuable enough to justify the most heinous of transactions. The trading records from 13th century Florence reveal the shocking mathematics of fashion-human exchanges. In the workshops of the textile district, master weavers maintained detailed ledgers showing that a single robe of Byzantine silk could command the price of 4 adult workers, while a complete outfit of imported fabrics, tunic, hose, mantle, and belt, might cost 8 human lives. These weren't wholesale purchases of clothing, but individual garments whose creation and transport made them literally worth more than the people who would never be allowed to wear them. Consider the case of Lady Marguerite de Montfort, whose wardrobe acquisitions in 1247 created a scandal that reached even papal attention. Desperate to appear appropriately dressed for the coronation of King Louis IX, she traded 37 serfs from her husband's lands to Flemish cloth merchants in exchange for a single ceremonial gown of gold thread and imported silk. The dress would be worn once. The people traded for it would serve their new masters for life. Yet in the social calculus of medieval nobility, her appearance at court was deemed more valuable than the freedom of nearly 40 human beings. The psychological mechanisms that enabled clothing human trades reveal the profound dehumanization inherent in medieval class systems. People of noble birth were trained from childhood to view lower classes as resources rather than individuals, no different from livestock or tools. A beautiful garment had immediate, visible value that enhanced the wearer's status, while the humans traded to obtain it remained invisible. their suffering hidden in distant workshops and fields. Archaeological evidence from medieval clothing trades has been discovered in surprising places. Excavations beneath Parisian fashion districts have revealed textile workshops with adjacent holding areas, where people awaiting trade for clothing were housed. The proximity suggests these transactions are so routine that cloth merchants design their facilities to accommodate both commodities, fabrics, and humans with equal efficiency. The seasonal rhythms of medieval court life drove predictable spikes in clothing human trading. Before major festivals, royal visits, or religious celebrations, the demand for fine apparel would surge, creating corresponding increases in human trafficking. Easter and Christmas seasons became particularly lucrative times for textile merchants, who could command premium prices in both fabrics and the humans traded to obtain them. Regional variations in textile production created complex networks of human exploitation. Italian silk weavers would accept payment in Northern European bondsmen, who would then be shipped to Mediterranean workshops where their unfamiliarity with local conditions made them particularly dependent on their new masters. English wool merchants traded people for Flemish weaving expertise, creating circular patterns where humans flowed in one direction while clothing flowed in another. The gender dimensions of clothing human trades reflected both fashion demands and social vulnerabilities. Women's elaborate court dress required more complex construction and expensive materials than men's clothing, making female fashion literally cost more in human lives. Simultaneously, women were often the preferred currency for these trades, their perceived docility and domestic skills making them valuable to textile workshop owners who needed reliable labor. The technical complexity of medieval textile production influenced human valuations in these trades. Simple homespun cloth might cost one person's freedom, but silk required specialized knowledge of sericulture, weaving, and dyeing that commanded premium prices. A master silk weaver could trade their services for a small group of people, while luxury items like cloth of gold or purple-dyed silks might require dozens of lives to obtain. Religious authorities found themselves complicit in clothing human trades despite official condemnation. Monasteries and convents, required to maintain appropriate ceremonial garments for important visitors and religious occasions, sometimes traded people from their lands to obtain necessary vestments. The moral contradiction of trading humans to purchase clothing for religious ceremonies created theological crises that were resolved through elaborate casuistry rather than fundamental reform. The documentation of clothing human trades reveals the bureaucratic normalization of human trafficking. Tailors' guilds maintained standardized price lists that included human exchange rates alongside fabric costs. A master craftsman's account book from 1289 Bruges shows entries for silk, gold thread, and 3 bonds of women listed with the same commercial detachment as any other business expense. The psychological impact on communities subjected to clothing human trades created lasting social disruption. Parents learned to fear well-dressed strangers visiting their villages, knowing that a textile merchant's arrival might mean family members would disappear in exchange for fabrics they would never see. Some communities developed codes and warning systems, but the fundamental powerlessness of medieval peasants made resistance largely futile. Quality assessment of both clothing and humans followed similar, dehumanizing procedures. Textile merchants developed expertise in evaluating human merchandise using criteria similar to their fabric assessment: durability, potential productivity, and aesthetic appeal. Young, healthy individuals were graded like fine cloth, premium quality commanding higher prices, while the old or infirm were valued like rough homespun. The international scope of clothing human trades created diplomatic complications that reveal the global nature of medieval human trafficking. When Byzantine silk merchants refused to accept European bondsmen as payment, citing quality concerns, it created a crisis that reached the level of international negotiations. The resolution involved establishing standardized human grading systems that allowed for consistent international exchange rates. The technological innovations in medieval textile production drove corresponding innovations in human trafficking logistics. As looms became more sophisticated and could produce finer fabrics, the workshops required more skilled labor, creating demand for specific types of human trades. People were increasingly evaluated not just for their general labor capacity, but for specific skills that complemented textile production. The social mobility implications of clothing human trades created perverse incentives within medieval society. Some individuals actually volunteered for bondage in exchange for their families receiving fine clothing that might elevate their social position. These trades represented desperate gambles that a temporary sacrifice might provide permanent social advancement, though such calculations rarely worked as hoped. The preservation of medieval garments in museums today carries this hidden history, each surviving piece potentially representing human lives traded for its creation. The elaborate court dress of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the ceremonial robes of various nobles, the ecclesiastical vestments preserved in cathedral treasuries all exist within this context where human freedom was literally woven into their construction. As we examine these clothing-human exchanges, we confront a disturbing truth about medieval priorities, that appearance often mattered more than humanity. The fabrics that displayed wealth and status carry the hidden cost of human bondage, with each thread potentially representing someone's freedom sacrificed on the altar of fashion. In a society where clothing determined social position, the true price of medieval fashion was measured not in gold or silver, but in human lives transformed into mere accessories for those wealthy enough to wear them. Number 8. Horses over humans. In the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare, the equation was stark and unforgiving. One destrier, a knight's war horse, held more value than several human lives combined. These four-legged instruments of war commanded such astronomical prices that groups of people were routinely traded for single animals. The combined humanity deemed less precious than one beast bred for battle. The medieval war horse represented the pinnacle of military technology, a living weapon system that could determine the outcome of battles and the fate of kingdoms. These animals, bred for size, strength, and aggression, underwent years of specialized training that made them as formidable as any human warrior. Their scarcity and military value created a market where human beings became the standard currency for equine acquisition. Trading records from 12th century England reveal the shocking exchange rates between horses and humans. In the stables of William Marshall, the greatest knight of his age, detailed accounts show that a single trained destrier was valued at the equivalent of 15 to 20 adult workers. When Marshall needed to expand his cavalry for King Richard's campaigns, he routinely traded groups of people from his lands to continental horse breeders, treating humans as interchangeable units of currency in his military calculations. Consider the case of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where the Norman victory was largely attributed to their superior cavalry. The horses that trampled English infantry weren't just military assets, they represented hundreds of human lives traded in the preceding years to acquire them. Duke William's war chest included not just gold and silver, but a reserve of bondsmen specifically maintained for horse trading with European breeders. The breeding and training of war horses required such specialized knowledge that it created entire communities dependent on human trafficking for their economic survival. The horse breeders of Normandy, famous throughout Europe for producing the finest destriers, maintained complex networks of human acquisition. They preferred strong young men from Germanic regions, whose physical capabilities made them valuable for the heavy labor required in horse management, but their unfamiliarity with local customs made them less likely to escape. Archaeological evidence from medieval horse breeding facilities reveals the integrated nature of equine and human trafficking operations. Excavations at breeding centers in France have uncovered stable complexes with adjacent human quarters that were clearly designed for restraint rather than comfort. The architectural layout suggests these facilities were planned to house both horses and the humans who would be traded to acquire them. The psychological dynamics of horse-human exchanges reflect the dehumanization inherent in medieval military culture. Knights were trained to value their horses as trusted companions and essential partners in warfare, while simultaneously viewing the humans traded to obtain these animals as expendable resources. This created a moral framework where animal welfare often received more consideration than human suffering. The regional variations in horse-human trading created complex networks of exploitation across medieval Europe. Spanish breeders, renowned for producing swift and nimble horses suitable for light cavalry, preferred payment in skilled craftsmen who could be put to work in their expanding workshops. German breeders, who specialized in the massive destriers favored by heavy cavalry, demanded agricultural workers who could support the enormous feed requirements of their animals. The seasonal patterns of horse-human trading followed the rhythms of medieval warfare and breeding cycles. Spring campaigns required fresh mounts, creating peak demand for horses and corresponding spikes in human trafficking. The breeding season also influenced trades, as pregnant mares commanded premium prices that might require entire families as payment. These seasonal fluctuations created predictable patterns of human misery tied directly to equine reproductive cycles. The quality assessment of both horses and humans in these transactions followed parallel dehumanizing methodologies. Horse traders developed expertise in evaluating human stock using criteria similar to their equine assessments: physical condition, age, temperament, and potential productivity. Young, healthy individuals were appraised like promising colts, while older or weaker people were valued like broken-down nags suitable only for basic labor. The military importance of horses created diplomatic incidents that reveal the international scope of human trafficking in service of equine acquisition. When King Philip Augustus of France restricted horse exports to England during tensions with King John, English nobles began raiding Irish and Scottish communities specifically to capture people for trade to European horse breeders. These diplomatic horse embargoes essentially created state-sponsored human trafficking networks. The technological aspects of medieval horse warfare drove specific human trafficking patterns. The development of heavier armor for both knights and horses required stronger, larger animals, which in turn demanded more human lives as payment. As military tactics evolved to emphasize cavalry charges, the premium on quality war horses increased proportionally, making humans even more expendable in the quest for equine superiority. Women's roles in horse-human trades reflected both medieval gender dynamics and the specific demands of equine management. While men were often preferred for the physical labor of horse care, women were valued for their potential to produce future workers and their perceived reliability in stable management. Some horse breeders specifically requested family units, calculating that the social bonds would reduce escape attempts while maximizing long-term productivity. The religious complications of horse-human trading created theological crises within medieval Christianity. Church doctrine held that humans were made in God's image while animals were merely beasts. Yet the practical reality saw Christians routinely valuing horses above fellow Christians. Some bishops attempted to condemn these practices, but the military necessity of cavalry made such moral positions untenable for secular authorities. The guild systems that regulated horse breeding and trading developed elaborate bureaucracies for managing human trafficking alongside equine commerce. The Horse Breeders' Guild of Flanders maintained detailed records showing standardized exchange rates, human values calibrated against horse quality with mathematical precision. These regulations weren't intended to protect people, but to prevent price manipulation and ensure consistent profit margins for guild members. The international nature of horse-human trades created complex logistics networks that spanned continents. Venetian merchants would ship humans from Slavic regions to Spanish horse breeders, then transport the acquired horses to Middle Eastern markets where they commanded premium prices. These circular trade routes created global economies where human suffering enabled military technology to flow across cultural and religious boundaries. The social disruption caused by horse-human trading created lasting trauma in affected communities. Villages learned to hide their young adults when horse traders approached, leading to elaborate early warning systems and resistance networks. Some communities would preemptively trade their weakest members to protect their strongest, creating internal hierarchies of expendability that poisoned social relationships for generations. The preservation of medieval war horses through selective breeding carried this hidden history of human trafficking. The bloodlines of today's heavy draft horses, Percherons, Clydesdales, Shires, can be traced back to medieval destriers whose acquisition cost hundreds of human lives. Each pedigree chart represents not just genetic lineage, but a genealogy of human suffering that enabled the development of these magnificent animals. The literary and cultural celebration of medieval cavalry created romantic narratives that obscured the human cost of equine military power. Epic poems and courtly romances praised the bond between knight and horse, the nobility of mounted warfare, and the glory of cavalry charges, while completely ignoring the human lives that were sacrificed to make such military spectacles possible. As we examine these horse-human exchanges, we confront a disturbing aspect of medieval military culture: the systematic devaluation of human life in service of equine warfare. The magnificent destriers that carried knights to victory, the swift coursers that enabled rapid communication, the sturdy palfreys that transported nobles across their domains all carried the hidden cost of human bondage. Each hoofbeat in medieval warfare represented not just military power, but a commodification of human existence in service of four-legged instruments of war. In the medieval calculus of military value, humans were reduced to mere purchasing power for the animals that truly mattered in the business of war and conquest. Number 9. Trinkets and jewelry. In the twisted marketplace of medieval human trafficking, perhaps no transactions reveal the profound evaluation of human life more starkly than the exchanges for trinkets and simple jewelry. Here, in deals that seem almost incomprehensibly trivial to modern eyes, entire human beings were traded for objects that today will be found in a costume jewelry shop. Cheap necklaces, metal mirrors, and simple ornaments that glittered briefly in candlelight before tarnishing into worthlessness. These weren't precious gems or masterworks of goldsmithing that commanded human lives, but the most basic of decorative objects, the kind of simple adornments that filled the lower tiers of medieval commerce. A rough-cast pewter brooch, a chain of base metal, a small mirror of polished brass. These insignificant trinkets became the currency of human bondage for those desperate enough to value momentary beauty over permanent freedom. The trading records from 13th century Baltic ports reveal the shocking banality of these exchanges. German merchants traveling the amber routes maintained ledgers showing that a single person could be purchased for as little as a brass arm ring or a small collection of glass beads. These weren't rare or valuable objects requiring skilled craftsmanship, but mass-produced trinkets manufactured in workshops that churned out thousands of identical pieces for the expanding medieval jewelry trade. Consider the case recorded in the Chronicle of Henry of Livonia, describing the conversion efforts in the Baltic regions during the early 13th century. Missionary traders would arrive at pagan settlements with bags of simple jewelry, bronze rings, glass beads, tin pendants, and systematically purchase people from their own families. A mother might trade her daughter for a handful of colored glass beads, valuing the immediate gratification of decorative objects over her child's freedom. The chronicles record these transactions with the same matter-of-fact tone used for any commercial exchange. The psychological mechanisms that enabled trinket human trades reveal the devastating impact of extreme poverty and social isolation on human judgment. In communities where metal objects were rare and decorative items almost unknown, the appearance of even simple jewelry could create an overwhelming desire that temporarily outweighed familial bonds. The immediate gratification of owning something beautiful, however briefly, could overcome rational calculation of long-term consequences. Archaeological evidence from medieval trading posts along the Russian river routes has uncovered massive quantities of simple jewelry alongside evidence of human trafficking operations. The sheer volume of trinkets found at these sites, thousands of basic rings, chains, and pendants, suggests that human trafficking for jewelry was conducted on an industrial scale, with merchants carrying vast inventories of cheap decorative objects specifically for purchasing people. The seasonal patterns of trinket human trading followed the rhythms of medieval merchant expeditions and seasonal celebrations. Spring and summer brought traveling traders with their caravans of cheap jewelry, creating predictable spikes in human trafficking as isolated communities encountered these tempting baubles after long winters of deprivation. Religious festivals provided particular opportunities, as the desire to appear decorated for celebrations overcame rational judgment about fair exchange rates. The regional variations in trinket human exchanges reflected local scarcities and cultural preferences. In Scandinavian communities where metalworking was less developed, even crude iron rings could purchase multiple people. In Slavic regions where glass making was unknown, simple glass beads commanded premium prices in human lives. These regional differences created systematic exploitation patterns as merchants learned exactly which trinkets were most effective in each area. The gender dimensions of jewelry human trades reveal particularly disturbing aspects of medieval social dynamics. Women, often denied access to property or trade, were simultaneously the primary targets of jewelry merchants and the most common currency offered in exchange. A woman might trade herself for a simple necklace, attracted by the momentary beauty and status it provided, only to discover that her new owner viewed her as far less valuable than the trinket that purchased her. The mass production techniques that made trinket human trading possible demonstrate early industrialization of human trafficking. Workshops in major cities like Cologne and Venice developed assembly line methods for producing thousands of identical jewelry pieces specifically for the human trafficking market. These weren't artisanal pieces but standardized products designed to maximize the efficiency of human acquisition operations. The quality deception inherent in trinket human trades reveals sophisticated manipulation techniques used by medieval merchants. Brass was polished to appear like gold, glass was cut to mimic precious stones, and base metals were given superficial treatments to appear valuable. The temporary illusion of worth was sufficient to complete transactions before buyers realized they had traded human lives for worthless objects. Religious authorities struggled with the moral implications of jewelry human exchanges, particularly when the trinkets themselves carried religious symbolism. Simple crosses, saint medallions, and religious pendants were commonly used to purchase people, creating theological crises about whether sacred symbols could justify such profane transactions. Some bishops attempted to bless cheap jewelry to increase its perceived value, inadvertently becoming complicit in human trafficking operations. The psychological trauma inflicted by trinket human trades extended beyond the immediate victims to entire communities. Families learned to distrust beautiful objects, knowing that the arrival of even simple jewelry might signal the loss of loved ones. Children were taught to fear merchants bearing gifts, creating cultural associations between beauty and danger that persisted for generations. The documentation of trinket human trades reveals the bureaucratic normalization of treating people as equivalent to worthless objects. Merchant accounts list glass beads, tin rings, and 2 bondswomen with identical commercial detachment. Guild regulations establish standard exchange rates between different types of cheap jewelry and various categories of humans, creating official price lists that institutionalize the devaluation of human life. The international scope of trinket human trading created global networks where cheap jewelry flowed one direction while human cargo moved in the other. Venetian glass beads would be shipped to Baltic regions to purchase Slavic captives, who would then be transported to Middle Eastern markets where they commanded higher prices than the trinkets that bought them. These circular trade routes demonstrated the global nature of medieval human trafficking. The technological innovations in cheap jewelry production were directly driven by human trafficking demands. Improvements in glassmaking, metalworking, and mass production techniques were motivated not by aesthetic considerations, but by the need to produce more effective tools for acquiring human beings. The medieval jewelry industry was essentially a subsidiary of the human trafficking trade. The social mobility implications of trinket human trades created perverse incentives within medieval communities. Some individuals believed that acquiring jewelry, however briefly, might somehow improve their social status enough to justify the trade of family members. These desperate calculations rarely worked as hoped, leaving families destroyed in exchange for objects that quickly lost their already minimal value. The preservation of medieval trinkets in archaeological collections today carries this hidden history of human trafficking. Museum displays of medieval jewelry often include pieces that were specifically manufactured for purchasing human beings. Each simple ring or crude pendant in these collections potentially represents someone's freedom traded for momentary beauty. The linguistic evolution of terms related to jewelry and bondage reveals the interconnected nature of these trades. Words for chain began to carry dual meanings, both decorative jewelry and instruments of human restraint. The vocabulary of medieval commerce increasingly conflated ornamental objects with human commodities, reflecting the normalized integration of beauty and bondage in medieval society. As we examine these trinket human exchanges, we confront perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of medieval human trafficking, the reduction of human lives to values less than the cheapest decorative objects. The simple necklaces that briefly adorned medieval necks, the crude rings that provided momentary status, the polished mirrors that reflected fleeting beauty all carry the hidden cost of human bondage. In the medieval marketplace of human misery, even the most worthless trinkets were deemed more valuable than the lives sacrificed to obtain them, creating a commerce of cruelty where beauty was literally purchased with human souls. Number 10. Sold for debts as small as a meal. In the most devastating of all medieval human trafficking scenarios, we encounter exchanges so trivial they seem impossible to modern comprehension. Entire human lives forfeited for debts no larger than the cost of a single meal. Here, in the crushing mechanics of medieval debt bondage, we witness how quickly a person could fall from freedom into slavery over obligations as small as a loaf of bread or a bowl of pottage. The feudal system created a perfect storm for debt-driven human trafficking through its combination of subsistence-level economics and absolute legal authority of lords over their tenants. Medieval peasants lived so close to starvation that even minor expenses could create insurmountable debt, while the legal framework provided landlords with unlimited power to extract human payment for these trivial obligations. Court records from 12th century English manors reveal the shocking specificity of meal debt human trades. The manor roll of Wistow from 1294 documents the case of Edgar the Plowman, who borrowed sixpence to purchase food during a particularly harsh April when grain stores ran low. Unable to repay this debt, equivalent to perhaps 2 days of labor, Edgar was bound over to his lord's service indefinitely. His freedom was forfeited for the cost of enough barley meal to feed his family for 3 days. The psychological mechanisms that enabled meal debt human trafficking reveal the brutal calculations forced upon medieval families by systemic poverty. Parents faced with starving children would accept any terms for immediate food, often without fully comprehending the legal implications of their agreements. The desperation of hunger made rational economic calculation impossible, creating opportunities for exploitation that landlords systematically utilized. Consider the documented case from the Abbey of St. Albans in 1248, where Brother Thomas recorded 57 instances of debt bondage incurred for food purchases totaling less than 1 shilling each. In one particularly heartbreaking entry, A widow named Matilda pledged herself and her 3 children as surety for 4 pence worth of oats, barely enough grain to make a single large pot of porridge. When harvest time came and she couldn't repay, the entire family was bound to Abby's service for life. The seasonal patterns of meal debt trafficking followed the brutal rhythms of medieval agricultural life. The hungry months of late winter and early spring, when grain stores ran low and new crops hadn't yet ripened, created predictable spikes in food debt human trafficking. Landlords would strategically make grain available during these periods, knowing that desperation would drive families to accept terms that effectively exchange human freedom for temporary sustenance. The legal frameworks that enabled meal debt human trafficking were carefully constructed to appear legitimate while being fundamentally exploitative. Manor courts would record these transactions as standard debt agreements, complete with formal documentation and witness testimony. The bureaucratic veneer of legality masked what was essentially systematic human trafficking disguised as normal commercial lending. Archaeological evidence from medieval peasant homes reveals the material conditions that made meal debt trafficking inevitable. Excavations at peasant settlements show living spaces with minimal food storage capacity and no evidence of surplus accumulation. These families lived literally hand-to-mouth, making them completely vulnerable to any disruption in their food supply and easy targets for debt-based human trafficking. The regional variations in meal debt trafficking reflected local agricultural conditions and legal traditions. In areas prone to frequent crop failures, landlords developed sophisticated systems for converting temporary food assistance into permanent human bondage. Regions with more stable agricultural productivity saw less meal debt trafficking, but during crisis years, even these areas would experience spikes in food-related human trading. The gender dimensions of meal debt human trafficking reveal how medieval legal systems systematically disadvantaged women and children. Widows were particularly vulnerable, lacking male protection and often responsible for children's welfare without adequate resources. Many debt bondage cases involved women pledging themselves and their children for food, creating multi-generational cycles of servitude initiated by single meals. The quantities of food involved in human debt exchanges demonstrate the extremity of medieval poverty. Court records show people bound into servitude for amounts of grain that wouldn't fill a modern shopping bag, perhaps 10 pounds of wheat or barley, enough for a family to survive a week at most. The ratio of human lifetime value to food quantity reveals a society where life itself was valued at starvation levels. The religious complications of meal debt human trafficking created significant theological problems for medieval Christianity. Church doctrine emphasized charity and feeding the hungry, yet ecclesiastical landlords were often the primary practitioners of converting food assistance into human bondage. Monasteries would provide charitable meals to desperate families, then claim these recipients as bondservants when repayment proved impossible. The intergenerational impact of meal debt human trafficking created hereditary cycles of bondage that could last for centuries. Children born to parents who had been bound for food debts inherited their parents' servitude, meaning that a single borrowed meal could enslave entire bloodlines. Manor records show families serving the same landlord families for generations, all originating from ancestral food debts. The psychological warfare inherent in meal debt trafficking involved deliberately creating food scarcities to generate opportunities for human acquisition. Some landlords would restrict grain sales during hungry months, then appear as benevolent creditors offering food assistance. This manufactured desperation ensured a steady supply of people willing to pledge their freedom for immediate sustenance. The documentation standards for meal debt human trafficking were often more detailed than those for major property transactions, reflecting the systematic nature of these operations. Scribes would carefully record not just the debt amount but also the specific foods provided, creating detailed inventories that treated human bondage with the same bureaucratic precision as livestock management. The economic multiplier effects of meal debt human trafficking demonstrate its systematic exploitation. A landlord might invest a few pence in grain during hungry months and acquire years or even lifetimes of human labor in return. This represented profit margins of thousands of percent, making meal debt trafficking one of the most lucrative forms of human exploitation in medieval society. The resistance strategies developed by medieval communities against meal debt trafficking included elaborate mutual aid systems and food-sharing networks. Some villages would collectively pool resources to prevent individual families from falling into food debt, recognizing that anyone who borrowed grain from the Lord was likely to lose their freedom permanently. The legal loopholes that enabled meal debt trafficking were carefully crafted to circumvent church and royal restrictions on human trafficking. By framing human bondage as debt repayment rather than slavery, landlords could engage in human trafficking while technically complying with laws that prohibited the outright sale of Christians. The international scope of meal debt trafficking extended even to diplomatic relations, as foreign merchants would provide food assistance to distressed communities specifically to acquire populations for export. Venetian traders operating in the Balkans would offer grain assistance during famines, then claim entire villages when repayment proved impossible. The medical consequences of chronic hunger that enabled meal debt trafficking created visible markers that helped traffickers identify vulnerable populations. Malnourished families could be easily spotted and targeted with food assistance that was designed from the beginning to create unpayable debts and subsequent human bondage. The social destruction caused by meal debt trafficking extended far beyond individual families to entire communities. Villages where meal debt bondage was common developed cultures of mutual suspicion and fear, as neighbors might inform landlords about families in distress to curry favor or avoid their own potential targeting. The preservation of medieval manor records today provides detailed documentation of these meal debt human trafficking operations. Modern historians studying these documents can trace exactly how many lives were destroyed for what amounts of food, creating a precise accounting of human misery measured in pounds of grain and bowls of pottage. As we conclude our examination of medieval human trafficking, the meal debt exchanges represent perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this dark history, the reduction of human lives to values less than basic sustenance. In these transactions, we witness the complete commodification of human existence, where freedom could be lost forever in exchange for enough food to survive a few more days. These debt bondage cases reveal a society where the line between assistance and exploitation was deliberately blurred, where charity became a tool of human trafficking, and where the basic human need for food was weaponized against the most vulnerable populations. The medieval meal that cost a human life represents not just individual tragedy, but systemic dehumanization that reduced people to economic calculations measured in spoonfuls of grain. In understanding these exchanges, salt for humans, weapons for families, clothing for children, horses for communities, trinkets for individuals, and meals for lifetimes of bondage, we glimpse the full horror of medieval human trafficking. Behind each transaction lay human stories of desperation, exploitation, and loss that remind us how easily civilization's veneer can slip away when human beings are reduced to mere commodities in the marketplace of survival. The strange things people were sold for in the Middle Ages were not truly strange at all. They were the predictable result of systematic dehumanization, economic desperation, and legal frameworks that prioritize property over people. In examining this history, we honor the memory of those whose lives were traded away, while ensuring that we never forget the human cost of systems that reduce people to objects of exchange.